She stopped the interview to ask for a tissue. Not because she was crying. She wasn't crying. In the entire course of the conversation, a conversation that would touch on weapons held to her face, men who forced themselves on her, a man who takes all of her money, and a future she may never reach, she did not cry once. She needed the tissue because she didn't want to mess up her makeup. That detail, that one, small, almost nothing detail, that's where this entire story lives. Not in the $1,000 a day, not in the man she calls daddy, not in the gun or the knife or the married men who drive to her in the dark and drive home to their wives in the light. The story lives in a tissue pressed carefully under each eye with the precision of someone who has learned, at 21 years old, that the most important skill in her line of work is not what she does with her body. It's what she does with her face. The makeup is armor. She knows this, even if she doesn't use that word. She put it on before she sat down, layer after layer, foundation and concealer and contour and highlight and liner and mascara and setting spray. The way a soldier puts on a vest before walking into a zone where things come at you that you cannot predict and cannot always survive. The makeup says, I am composed. I am in control. I am not the kind of person you need to worry about. And the tissue is the maintenance tool. The small, white, disposable instrument that keeps the armor intact when the edges start to soften. When the questions get close to something real. When the air in the room shifts and something behind her eyes moves. Just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before the mask catches it and pins it back in place. She asked for the tissue and then she said, I'm sorry. She apologized. In the middle of a conversation about having weapons pointed at her, about encountering men who were forceful, about handing all of her earnings to a man she met on Instagram, about losing her belief in marriage at 21, she apologized for the possibility that she might show an emotion. That apology is the most honest thing she says in the entire conversation, because it reveals what the makeup and the confidence and the careful language are designed to conceal. That underneath the mask, there is a 21-year-old woman who knows, at a level deeper than words, deeper than rationalization, deeper than the game, that something is wrong. She may not name it. She may not name it for years. She may never name it. But the tissue knows. And the apology knows. And somewhere underneath the setting spray and the $1,000 days and the man who takes her money and calls it management, she knows too. Her name, or at least the name she gave, is Vea. She's 21 years old. She was born and raised in Las Vegas. She holds a valid cosmetology license from the state of Nevada. She has a family that loves her and a dream of owning a hair salon and a credit score that's finally climbing and a man who controls her income and a collection of memories involving weapons that she's filed away under part of the game. She's been in the game for 1 year. 1 year and a couple of days. She specifies, with the precision of someone who is, whether she realizes it or not, still counting. This is her story. But it's not just her story. It's a story about the distance between $33,000 and $260,000, and what happens to a human being who tries to cross that distance in the dark. It's a story about a crossroads that millions of young Americans stand at every year, and about the men who wait at that crossroads with offers that sound like opportunities and function like traps. It's a story about the masks we build to survive the choices we've made, and about what happens to the face underneath when the mask has been on so long that nobody, not even the person wearing it, can remember what was there before. It starts, as these stories always do, with a family, with money, with the lack of it, and with a city that was built on the principle that the house always wins. Las Vegas is two cities that share a name and almost nothing else. The first Las Vegas is the one the world knows. The Strip, the casinos, the neon, the place where people come to pretend that the ordinary rules of life have been suspended, that money flows freely, that luck is a system, that what happens here somehow doesn't count. 60 million tourists visit this Las Vegas every year. They leave behind approximately $43 billion in revenue. They take home hangovers and memories and the vague, pleasurable sense that they've touched something dangerous and walked away unscathed. The second Las Vegas is the one where Vea grew up. It's the Las Vegas that exists in the spaces between the casinos, the residential neighborhoods and strip malls and apartment complexes where families live paycheck to paycheck in one of the most expensive cities in America. This Las Vegas doesn't appear in tourism brochures. There are no fountains here, no shows, no buffets with crab legs piled in glistening mountains. There are check-cashing stores and auto title loan offices and cosmetology schools with tuition plans, and now hiring signs in salon windows offering $12 an hour plus tips. Vea grew up in the second Las Vegas. She's matter-of-fact about it. When asked about the roughest part of her childhood, she doesn't tell a story of catastrophe. No abuse. No foster system. No nights sleeping in cars. She describes something much more common and, in its own way, much more insidious. Parents living check to check, she says. The regular, everyday struggle. The regular, everyday struggle. She says it the way you describe the weather. A condition so constant and so pervasive that it barely registers as a condition at all. It's just the texture of life. The background hum. The thing that's always there when you wake up and still there when you go to sleep, and so thoroughly embedded in every decision and every conversation and every choice that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic if you live on a busy street. Her family was intact. Her mother was present. Her stepfather, whom she considers her real father, was present and involved, and someone she still sees when she's not working. There was love in the house. There was stability of the kind that doesn't make headlines because it's not dramatic enough for a news cycle. The stability of people who show up every day and do the work and hold it together and never quite get ahead. Her birth father died when she was 12. She mentions this briefly, without visible emotion, sandwiched between details about her family structure as if it's a logistical fact rather than a seismic event. He passed away, but she's always had her stepdad. She moves on. Whether the death of her father at 12 is a wound she's processed or a wound she's buried is not something a single interview can determine. What can be observed is the speed with which she moves past it. The practiced efficiency of a person who has learned not to linger on things that hurt. This skill, the ability to acknowledge something painful and immediately redirect, will show up again and again in her story, in different forms, applied to different wounds, each time a little more polished, a little more automatic. By the time she's sitting in the interview chair at 21, she will be able to describe a man holding a weapon to her face and move on to the next topic without breaking stride. That skill didn't develop in the game. It developed in the second Las Vegas, in a household where love was plentiful and money was not, and where a 12-year-old girl learned that some things are too big to look at directly, and the only way to survive them is to glance and keep walking. She graduated high school. She went to cosmetology school. She earned a professional license. She did, by every conventional measure, exactly what society asks young people in her circumstances to do. She identified a skill, she trained for it, she earned a credential, and she prepared to enter the workforce as a legitimate, licensed professional. And then she encountered the math. The math is simple. A licensed cosmetologist in Las Vegas, and this is not anecdote but data sourced from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, earns a median annual wage of approximately $33,000. In a city where the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment has crossed $1,400 per month and continues to climb, where a reliable used car costs a year's savings, where health insurance is a luxury and a single medical emergency can erase a decade of careful budgeting, $33,000 is not a living. It's a maintenance dose. It's enough to keep you alive and not enough to let you build anything. Vea wanted to build things. She wanted a salon, her own salon, not a chair she rented in someone else's shop. She wanted a car. She wanted an apartment with her name on the lease. She wanted a credit score that opened doors instead of closing them. She wanted, in short, what the American economic mythology promises to anyone willing to work hard and play by the rules. Upward mobility. A future that's bigger than the present. A life that's more than the regular, everyday struggle. The cosmetology license could not deliver that future. Not in a year. Not in 5 years. Maybe not in 20. The math was clear, and Vea, whatever else may be true about her, is not bad at math. She describes her pre-game life with a phrase that's worth slowing down on. She says she was dibbling and dabbling, engaging in intimate encounters with various people outside of any transactional framework for no compensation. She characterizes this as a kind of amateur precursor to what she does now. The implication is clear. The activity itself was already happening. The only thing missing was the money. This framing serves an important psychological function. It allows Vea to locate the origin of her current life, not in a moment of exploitation or coercion or desperation, but in a natural progression. She was already doing this. She simply professionalized it. The way a home cook might open a restaurant. The way a weekend photographer might start charging for sessions. It's a clean narrative. It has internal logic. And it completely obscures the role of the person who turned the dibbling and dabbling into a career. Because Vea did not professionalize herself. Someone professionalized her. And the difference between those two things is the difference between entrepreneurship and recruitment. Underscore. Here is how it happened, in Vea's own words. She was at a social gathering with an acquaintance, a random guy, she calls him. At that gathering, she met another man. She followed him on Instagram. She noticed that he had multiple women around him. She noticed that he appeared to be involved in this kind of work. He noticed her too. He noticed what she posted. And then he said the sentence that changed the trajectory of her life. You know, you should try and come make money, and I can show you how good the game can be. That sentence deserves to be examined the way a forensic linguist examines a ransom note. Not for what it says on its surface, but for what it reveals about the speaker's understanding of the listener. Start with the first word, you. Not, I need, or I want, or I'm looking for. The sentence is framed entirely around Vea. Her potential, her benefit, her future. The speaker has made himself invisible. He's not a man seeking to profit from a young woman's body. He's a mentor identifying untapped talent. You should try, not you must, or you will, or come work for me. The language of suggestion, not command. The language of opportunity, not obligation. She's not being told. She's being invited. And an invitation, by definition, can be declined, which means that accepting it feels like a choice. Come make money. The verb is active, not passive. She's not being used. She's making. The money is hers. In this framing, she's the agent, the producer, the entrepreneur. The fact that she will hand all of it to him is a detail that doesn't appear in the pitch. I can show you how good the game can be. The promise of revelation, of insider knowledge, of a world that's better than it looks from the outside, and that only someone who's already inside can properly introduce you to. This is the language of initiation, the same language used by fraternities and cults and multi-level marketing schemes, and every other system that needs to recruit new members into structures that primarily benefit existing ones. The entire sentence is a masterpiece of psychological engineering. It costs him nothing to say. It promises everything without guaranteeing anything. And it lands, with devastating precision, on a 21-year-old woman who has a cosmetology license and $33,000 worth of future, and a gap between where she is and where she wants to be that feels, from where she's standing, like a canyon. Now, I want to be very careful here, because there's a version of this analysis that treats Vea as a passive object, a thing that was acted upon, manipulated, tricked. And that version, while it may serve certain ideological purposes, does not match Vea's own account of her experience. She does not describe herself as a victim. She describes herself as someone who evaluated an opportunity and accepted it. She uses the language of agency, of choice, of business. And I want to respect that. I want to respect it because Vea is a human being with the right to define her own experience. And because stripping her of agency in order to fit her into a victim narrative is its own form of dehumanization. one that progressive and conservative commentators both engage in, from different angles, for different reasons, with equal condescension. But I also want to be honest. And honesty requires acknowledging that the line between opportunity and exploitation is not always drawn by the person being exploited. It's drawn by the system. And the system that produced the man on Instagram, the sentence he said, and the response it generated in Vea, is not a system that has her best interests at its center. There's a term in academic literature that doesn't get enough public airtime. It's called the boyfriend model of recruitment, and it was described extensively by Dr. Melissa Farley, who has spent over 3 decades researching the psychology of prostitution through the organization Prostitution Research and Education. The boyfriend model works like this. A recruiter, and I'm going to use that word deliberately, instead of the word that popular culture has turned into a costume and a punchline, identifies a young person, usually female, usually between 16 and 24, who meets several criteria. The first criterion is economic instability. Not necessarily poverty, not the kind of destitution that forces immediate, survival-level decisions, but the subtler condition of seeing the gap between what you earn and what things cost, the gap between where you are and where you want to be, the gap between the life your credentials promise and the life your paycheck delivers. Vea had this gap. She had it precisely because she'd done everything right, graduated, trained, earned a license, and discovered that right and enough are not synonyms. The second criterion is prior normalization of intimate exchange. This is the uncomfortable one. Vea herself describes it. She was already engaging in intimate encounters without a transactional framework. The recruiter didn't have to convince her that intimacy could be exchanged. He only had to convince her that it should be exchanged for money. And that conviction, that the only difference between what she was already doing and what he was proposing was the presence of compensation, is the hinge on which the entire recruitment turns. Because it transforms the decision from should I sell my body? A question that triggers moral alarm bells, into should I get paid for something I'm already giving away for free? A question that triggers economic logic. The third criterion, and researchers consistently identify it as the most predictive, is a gap in attachment. Specifically, paternal attachment. Vea's birth father died when she was 12. She has a stepfather she loves, and she's clear about that. But the word she uses for her recruiter, daddy, is a word that carries weight far beyond its industry usage. It is a word that describes, simultaneously, a business relationship and an emotional one. A word that says, this person manages me, and also, this person fills a role that someone else was supposed to fill and didn't. I don't want to overstate this. Not every woman who enters the game has a dead or absent father. Not every young woman with a dead father enters the game. Correlation is not causation, and pop psychology is not a substitute for rigorous analysis. But the pattern exists in the data, and Vea fits the pattern. And the word she chose to describe the man who recruited her is not a word that a person uses lightly, whatever they tell themselves about its meaning. She decided to try. Those are her words. She decided to try, the way you might decide to try a new restaurant or a new workout routine. The lightness of the language is itself a data point. It suggests that the decision, in the moment, didn't feel heavy, didn't feel irreversible, didn't feel like the kind of thing you should probably think about for a long time before doing. It felt like accepting an invitation to see how good the game can be. And then the money started. Let's talk about money. Not because money is the most important part of this story. It isn't, though Vea would likely disagree, but because money is the language in which the story is told, by Vea and by everyone around her. Money is the reason she entered. Money is the metric she uses to measure the game's value. Money is the thing she uses to justify the danger and the degradation and the slow erosion of her interior world. And money, this is the part she doesn't see yet, is the mechanism by which she is controlled. Her daily target is $1,000. She works every day, or tries to. She describes this income as pretty good. She describes it as tax-free. She says the money has been a good choice. On the surface, the arithmetic is staggering. $1,000 a day, even working only 5 days a week, is $260,000 a year. That's more than most doctors earn in their first years of practice. More than most mid-career attorneys. More than the combined household income of many American families. It's a number that, stated in isolation, in a vacuum, stripped of all context, sounds like freedom incarnate. But money is never in isolation. Money exists in a system. And the system Vea operates in has costs that she mentions in passing and seems to dismiss quickly, but that, when examined with the kind of rigor that the game doesn't encourage its participants to apply, change the arithmetic entirely. The first cost is the cut. Vea says she gives her money to daddy. She doesn't specify a percentage. She doesn't use the word percentage at all. She says she gives him the money, all of it, apparently, and he provides her with things in return. When asked what she gets out of the arrangement, she lists. He's raised her credit score, he's helping her get an apartment, he's working on getting her a car. In studies of this particular economic structure, studies conducted by the Urban Institute, by Polaris, by the Department of Justice, the average retained earnings for the person doing the actual labor range from 10 to 25% of gross income. The rest goes to the person who controls the infrastructure, the manager, the daddy. If Vea retains 20% of her daily $1,000, she's earning $200 a day. That's $73,000 a year, still more than double what cosmetology would pay her, but a far cry from the $260,000 that the headline number suggests. And if she retains 10%, which is not uncommon, she's earning $100 a day. $36,500 a year. $3,500 more than the cosmetology license. For work that involves weapons and men who are forceful, and the slow demolition of her capacity to believe in love. I don't know Vea's specific arrangement. She may retain more than average. She may retain less. But the structure she describes, earning, surrendering, receiving back selectively, is consistent with what researchers call a managed economy. And a managed economy, by definition, is designed to benefit the manager. Here is what Vea says she's received in exchange for a year of earnings: a better credit score, movement toward an apartment, movement toward a car. These are real things, tangible things, things she could point to and say, see, the arrangement is working, the game is delivering what it promised. But consider this. If Vea had access to her own gross income, even half of it, she could hire a credit repair service for a few $100s. She could put a deposit on an apartment. She could buy a car. She could do all of these things herself, on her own timeline, without requiring anyone's permission or approval. The fact that she can't, the fact that these things come to her through him, on his schedule, by his decision, is not a feature of a business partnership. It's a feature of a controlled economy. The same structure that company towns used in the early 20th century. Pay the workers in scrip redeemable only at the company store, and the workers will never accumulate enough independent capital to leave. Vea's credit score is the company store. The apartment is the company store. The car is the company store. All genuine, all useful, all real, and all flowing through a single point of control that is not her. She describes this arrangement as something that makes her life easier. There's a concept in behavioral economics called learned dependency through structured benevolence. It describes a dynamic in which one person provides genuine, tangible, verifiable benefits to another, but only through a system that requires the beneficiary to surrender autonomy in order to access those benefits. The benefits are real. The dependency is also real. And the genius of the system is that the reality of the benefits obscures the reality of the dependency. Vea isn't being beaten into compliance. She isn't being locked in a room. She isn't being threatened with violence from her recruiter, at least, not that she describes. She is being managed. Managed through a system of selective generosity that makes the manager feel indispensable and makes the managed person feel grateful. And gratitude, in a managed economy, is the most effective restraint ever invented. It costs nothing. It produces no bruises. It leaves no evidence. And it works better than any lock, because the person in the managed position doesn't just stay, they stay willingly. They stay appreciatively. They sit in an interview chair and describe the person managing them as someone who takes care of them, and they believe it, because the credit score is real and the apartment is coming and the car is in progress. And what more proof do you need that this is working? The second cost is the legal risk. Las Vegas. And this is a fact that surprises many people, because the city's reputation suggests otherwise, does not permit legal prostitution within its city limits or anywhere in Clark County. Nevada's famous legal brothel system operates exclusively in rural counties with populations below a certain threshold. Within Las Vegas itself, solicitation is a misdemeanor for a first offense and escalates with subsequent arrests. A criminal record, any criminal record, creates barriers to employment, housing, and professional licensing that can persist for decades. Vea holds a cosmetology license. That license is subject to the oversight of the Nevada State Board of Cosmetology, which has the authority to revoke, suspend, or place conditions on licenses held by individuals who have been convicted of certain offenses. A single arrest could set in motion a process that ends with the revocation of the very credential that represents Vea's path out of the game. This is the trap within the trap. The game promises money that funds the exit plan, but the game also accumulates risk that can destroy the exit plan. Each night Vea works is simultaneously a deposit into the salon fund and a roll of the dice that could eliminate the salon forever. And she's rolling those dice every day because the quota is $1,000 and the rent is due and the credit score needs another payment. And the car is almost within reach, and tomorrow she'll work just one more day, and one more day, and one more day until the one more day has become a year and a couple of days, and the counting hasn't stopped because some part of her, the part that reaches for tissues and says, "I'm sorry," knows that counting is the only thing tethering her to a timeline that has an end. The third cost is the physical danger. Vea describes two specific incidents. In one, someone produced a firearm during an encounter. In the other, someone held a blade to her face. She describes additional encounters with individuals who were more forceful or aggressive. She does not elaborate on what happened during these incidents. She does not describe the outcomes. She does not describe the moments between the appearance of the weapon and the resolution of the situation, the seconds or minutes in which a 21-year-old woman was alone in a room with a stranger and a weapon and no guarantee that she would leave that room alive. She describes these events, and then she says, "Not really," meaning it doesn't make her second-guess the work. And then she says, "I know it's just a part of the game." There's a clinical term for this. It's called threat normalization, and it's one of the most thoroughly documented psychological phenomena in high-risk environments. Military psychologists have studied it in combat veterans. Occupational psychologists have studied it in emergency responders. Sociologists have studied it in residents of high-crime neighborhoods. The mechanism is straightforward. When exposure to danger is constant and the danger-producing environment cannot be easily exited, either because exit is physically impossible or because the perceived costs of exit exceed the perceived costs of staying, the human brain recalibrates its threat baseline. What was terrifying becomes unpleasant. What was unpleasant becomes routine. What was routine becomes invisible. This recalibration is not bravery. It's not toughness. It's not evidence of a well-adjusted person making peace with risk. It's a neurological adaptation, the brain's way of maintaining functional capacity in an environment that would otherwise produce debilitating anxiety. The person who has undergone this adaptation can still describe the dangerous events. They can recall them, narrate them, even use them as anecdotes. What they can't do, in many cases, is accurately assess the level of danger they represent. Vea has been in the game for 1 year. She has already experienced weapons-level violence at least twice. She has already encountered sexual coercion multiple times. And her assessment is that these things are not too much of a deterrent. The average career span in the sex trade, according to a widely cited 2014 study published in the journal Violence Against Women, is 5 to 7 years. The reasons for exit are rarely voluntary retirement. They are arrest, Addiction, severe physical harm that makes continued work impossible. Or death. Those are actuarial numbers. They're aggregates. They don't predict any individual's outcome, and they may not apply to Vea. But they exist. And they deserve to share space in the conversation with the $1,000 a day number that makes the arithmetic look so good from the outside. Vea is 1 year in. It deserves a straightforward answer. And Vea gives one. But the answer, straightforward as it is, contains a demolition. I feel like at this point marriage is just marriage. She says this at 21. 1 year into the game. And in those 9 words, she has compressed a lifetime of relationship damage into a single sentence. Let me unpack what she's saying. She's not saying marriage is bad. She's not saying marriage is a lie. She's saying marriage is just marriage, an institution stripped of its emotional content, reduced to a legal and social arrangement that has no necessary connection to fidelity, intimacy, or love. Marriage is just marriage. The way a chair is just a chair. The way weather is just weather. A thing that exists. A thing that happens. A thing that is neither more nor less than its most mechanical description. And she arrived at this conclusion not through philosophical study or bitter personal experience with a failed marriage of her own, but through occupational exposure. Through being, night after night, the person that married men come to when their marriages aren't enough. Through accumulating a data set composed entirely of men who have made the central promise of the institution and broken it, quietly, deliberately, for cash, in rooms that their wives don't know about. She says she still believes in love. She says it definitely. But she also says she doesn't see herself wanting to get married. Just because of that, she says, meaning just because of what she's seen. Just because of the data. There's a concept in occupational psychology called professional deformation, from the French déformation professionnelle, and it describes the way that prolonged immersion in the realities of a specific profession changes the practitioner's personality, worldview, and relational patterns in ways that persist long after the practice has ended. Surgeons become emotionally detached in their personal relationships. Police officers begin to see threat in mundane interactions. Criminal defense attorneys develop a statistically skewed sense of human guilt. Therapists absorb so much of other people's pain that they lose the ability to process their own. These aren't choices. They're not failures of character. They're the predictable, documented consequences of swimming in a particular current for long enough that the current becomes indistinguishable from the water itself. Vea has been swimming in a very specific current for 1 year. The current is composed of married men paying for something their marriages don't provide. And the water has already changed her. There's a parallel concept in cognitive psychology called the availability heuristic, the tendency to estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples of that event come to mind. If you spend your days reading about airplane crashes, you will overestimate the probability that airplanes crash. If you spend your time in hospitals, you will overestimate the prevalence of disease. And if you spend your nights with unfaithful husbands, you will overestimate the probability that all husbands are unfaithful. Vea's sample is not representative. She encounters married men who seek out sex workers, a self-selecting subset that is, by definition, not reflective of married men as a population. But the human brain doesn't automatically adjust for sampling bias. The brain works with the data it has. And the data Vea has, the only data she's been accumulating for the past year, night after night, client after client, tells a story about marriage that is devastating in its consistency. At 21, she has seen enough to conclude that marriage is just marriage. At 22, the conclusion will be deeper. At 23, deeper still. And by the time she exits the game, if she exits the game, the conclusion will be so deeply embedded in her reflexive understanding of the world that it will function not as an opinion, but as a fact. A thing she knows in her body, in her bones, in the way she flinches from commitment or freezes at the word trust, or reaches for a tissue when the conversation gets too close to the question of whether she can imagine being loved in a way that doesn't come with a price tag. That's the cost that doesn't show up in the daily thousand. The slow, invisible, irreversible recalibration of a 21-year-old woman's capacity to believe in the possibility of genuine, faithful, enduring love. And nobody's tracking it. There's no ledger for this cost. No accountant. No credit score that measures the net worth of a human heart. The money comes in and the money goes out, and the credit score climbs and the apartment gets closer and the car is almost within reach, and nobody. Not Vea, not the man she gives her money to, not the married men who fund the operation. Nobody is keeping a record of what's being spent on the other side of the balance sheet. She says she still believes in love. She says it definitely. I hope she's right. And I fear she's already wrong. Underscore. I need to talk about the most uncomfortable word in this entire story. Choice. It's the word that everyone uses. Vea, her recruiter, the clients, the legal system, the cultural commentators, the advocates on both sides of the debate. It's the word that does more work and conceals more truth than any other word in the English language when applied to this subject. Vea uses it. I decided to try, she says. She describes her entry into the game as a decision, a rational, volitional, autonomous act performed by a free agent in an open market. She decided. She tried. She found it good. She continued. Her recruiter used it, implicitly, in the structure of his pitch. You should try. Not you must. Not you will. Should. Try. The language of invitation, of suggestion, of freedom. The freedom to say yes. Which means, by implication, the freedom to have said no. Which means, by further implication, that saying yes was a choice. Her choice. Made freely. Nobody forced her. The clients use it too. Every man who drives to the location where Vea works, negotiates terms, pays money, and drives home. Each of them, if asked, would describe his participation as a choice. A transaction between consenting adults. A private arrangement that harms no one. His choice. Her choice. Everyone's choosing. Everyone's free. And society uses the word from both directions. Conservatives say she chose poorly, that she had a license and a family and a path and she abandoned it for easy money, and the consequences are hers to bear. Progressives say she chose freely, that sex work is work, that bodily autonomy is absolute, that the only problem is the criminalization. Both sides use the word choice to close the file, to end the inquiry, to arrive at a conclusion that doesn't require further thought. I've been circling this word for a long time, and I've come to believe that it's the word we use when we don't want to look at the system. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine a 21-year-old woman standing at a crossroads. This is not a metaphor. This is the structural reality of her situation, stripped of narrative and reduced to its economic bones. Behind her is everything she knows. A family that loves her. A high school diploma. A cosmetology license. The near mathematical certainty that these credentials will keep her in exactly the position her parents occupy, surviving, but not thriving. Present, but not progressing. One paycheck from crisis, one emergency from catastrophe, for the rest of her working life. In front of her are two paths. Path A is the legitimate path. Use the license. Work in a salon. Start at $33,000. Save what she can, which will be almost nothing after rent and car payments and insurance and food, and the 100 small expenses that constitute the operating cost of being alive in a city that was built for tourists. Accumulate savings slowly, so slowly, and hope that nothing goes wrong along the way. No medical emergency. No car breakdown. No recession. No pandemic. No landlord raising the rent. No anything that disrupts the glacial progress of Path A, because Path A has no margin for error. Path A requires perfection, sustained over years, in a life that does not permit perfection. And at the end of Path A, maybe in 10 years, maybe 15, maybe 20, a salon. Maybe, if everything goes right. Which, statistically, in the economic bracket Vea occupies, it probably won't. Path B is the man on Instagram. Within weeks of choosing Path B, she's earning more per day than Path A earns per month. Within a year, Her credit score is climbing. She's talking about apartments and cars, and she's sitting in a chair telling a stranger she has no regrets. Path B has a gun in it. Path B has a knife in it. Path B has men who are forceful, and nights that take something from her that she can't name yet, and a man who controls her money and calls it management, and an expiration date she doesn't know about yet. But Path A, and this is the part that the word choice is designed to help us not see, Path A has its own violence. It's just slower, quieter, more socially acceptable. It's the violence of wages that don't match the cost of existing. The violence of a system that gives a young woman a professional credential and then pays her less than a living wage to use it. The violence of watching your parents work themselves through every year of your childhood and knowing, with the kind of certainty that lives in your chest rather than your head, that you're looking at your own future. So when we say Vea chose this, what exactly are we saying? Are we saying she surveyed all available options, with complete and accurate information about the risks and outcomes of each, in an environment free from economic pressure and emotional manipulation and the fundamental asymmetry of power between a 20-year-old woman and a man who makes his living recruiting 20-year-old women and selected, rationally, deliberately, with full agency, the option that best aligned with her informed preferences? Or are we saying she stood at a crossroads where both paths were brutal, and she picked the one with the faster paycheck? Because those are very different things. And the word choice, that convenient, reassuring, file-closing word, can mean either one. And the reason it gets used so often, by so many people, in so many different arguments, is precisely because its ambiguity lets everyone arrive at the conclusion they were already looking for. I don't have a resolution to this question. I'm genuinely not certain there is one. The philosophy of free will has occupied human thinkers for millennia without producing consensus, and I'm not arrogant enough to believe that a documentary about a 21-year-old woman in Las Vegas is going to settle what Aristotle and Kant and Sartre couldn't. But I do know this. The word choice should not end the conversation. It should begin it. And anyone who uses it as a conclusion, from any direction, for any purpose, is selling something. The file should stay open. Underscore 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 underscore. Every conversation about this industry focuses on the women, their stories, their choices, their trauma, their bodies, their futures. And there's a reason for that. The women bear the overwhelming majority of the physical danger, the legal risk, the social stigma, and the psychological damage. The women are the visible participants, the arrestable participants, the photographable participants, the interviewable participants. But there is an entire category of participant in Vea's world that receives almost no scrutiny, that is almost never asked to sit in a chair, on camera, and explain itself, that moves through this economy with the frictionless anonymity of water through a pipe. The clients. Vea says most of them are older than her. She says a lot of them are married. Definitely, she says, with the emphasis of someone stating not an exception but a norm. She doesn't judge them. When the interviewer raises the subject of karma, specifically, whether sleeping with married men carries negative karmic weight, Vea offers a response that is remarkable in its pragmatic logic. It is, she says, acknowledging the moral weight. But at the same time, it's not like I'm forcing them. She's right. She isn't forcing anyone. The men who seek her out do so of their own volition. They drive to a specific location. They initiate contact. They negotiate terms. They exchange money for a service. They drive home. At every point in this sequence, they are exercising the kind of unambiguous, uncoerced, fully informed agency that the word choice was built to describe. They are, by any reasonable definition, more agentive in this transaction than Vea is. They have more money, more power, more options, more freedom to walk away at any point without consequence. They are not being managed by a daddy. They are not meeting a quota. They are not sleeping with strangers because a man on Instagram showed them how good the game can be. They are doing this because they want to. because they have decided that the vows they made and the families they built and the trust that was placed in them by another human being are less important in this moment than whatever it is they're driving toward. And yet, in the legal framework that governs Vea's world, it is Vea who is committing the crime. Vea who will be arrested. Vea whose mugshot will appear in a local news segment about cleaning up the streets. Vea whose cosmetology license will be jeopardized. Vea whose name will enter a database that follows her for the rest of her life, limiting her employment, her housing, her ability to build the future she describes wanting so badly. The married man drives home, places his wedding ring back on his finger, or removes it from the glove compartment where he put it 30 minutes ago, because some of them think of that detail the way some shoplifters think to remove security tags. He walks through his front door. He faces no legal consequence, no social consequence, no professional consequence. His name enters no database. His license, if he has one, in whatever profession, is not reviewed. His future is not jeopardized. His mask, the ring, the smile, the "how was your day, honey," is intact. This asymmetry is so deeply embedded in the way we talk about this subject that most people have never noticed it. The entire cultural machinery, the laws, the enforcement, the media coverage, the documentary format itself, is oriented toward the woman. She is the subject. She is the problem. She is the data point, the case study, the cautionary tale, the human interest story. He is invisible. Vea noticed. At 21, 1 year into the game, she noticed. She says, "I'm doing it, and I'm getting money for doing things with men, and other people are not, and they're doing it every day or every weekend, and just to get what? A memory." There's a strange, clear-eyed logic in that observation. A 21-year-old sex worker has articulated something that moral philosophers have debated for centuries without resolution. If the act itself is the same, what is the moral status of the compensation? Is the woman who has sex with multiple partners for free somehow more virtuous than the woman who receives payment? And if so, what exactly is she being rewarded for? Her financial inefficiency? I'm not endorsing Vea's framework. I'm noting that it exists, and that it possesses a kind of internal consistency that most people would find uncomfortable to engage with directly. And I'm noting, further, that the discomfort it produces is itself informative. Because the discomfort doesn't come from a flaw in Vea's logic. It comes from the collision between her logic and the unexamined assumptions that most of us carry about what sex means, what money means, and what the intersection of the two is allowed to look like. But I want to move past the philosophy and into something more concrete. Because Vea's relationship with her clients is not just transactional. It's transformational, and not in the way that word usually implies. Every client Vea sees adds a data point to her model of the world. And because her clients are overwhelmingly married men, men who have made the most public and most binding promise of fidelity that our culture offers, and who have driven through the dark to break it, the data set she's accumulating is catastrophically skewed. She's not seeing men at their best. She's not seeing men at their average. She's seeing men at their most dishonest, their most covert, their most willing to sacrifice the trust of someone who loves them for something they could describe to no one without shame. And from that data set, accumulated over a year of nights, she has drawn the conclusion that will shape every relationship she attempts for the rest of her life. Marriage is just marriage. She's 21. She's been gathering this data for 12 months. Imagine what the data set looks like at 25, at 30, at the point, if that point comes, when she exits the game and tries to build the kind of life that requires trusting someone, trusting a man, trusting that when he says, "I love you," and "I'll be faithful," and "you're the only one," he means it. The data will tell her he doesn't. The data will tell her that men drive through the dark and take off their rings and pay for what their vows were supposed to guarantee. The data will tell her that marriage is just marriage, a ceremony, a document, a ring that goes in the glove compartment and comes back out again, and none of it means what they said it meant on the day they stood in front of their families and made the promise. That data is wrong. It's skewed by a sample that is not representative of men, or of marriages, or of the human capacity for fidelity. But data that's wrong can still be compelling. And data that's been absorbed through lived experience, through the body, through the senses, through hundreds of encounters with hundreds of men who prove the conclusion true, is almost impossible to overwrite with the kind of abstract, statistical counter-evidence that says most men don't do this. Most marriages aren't like this. The sample is biased. The conclusion is premature. You can't argue someone out of what they've learned in their body. You can only hope that they accumulate different data, eventually, in a different context. And for that to happen, they have to leave the context that's producing the bad data. They have to leave the game. Which brings us to the salon. There is a moment in every conversation like this. And I have had many of them, across many years, with many people living in many kinds of shadows, where the person tells you about the future. The future is always bright. The future always has a salon, or a business, or a degree, or a house with a yard and a garden and a dog named something hopeful. The future is always the reason the present is tolerable. The future is the story the person tells themselves at 4 in the morning when the night has been long and the body is tired and the mask needs more maintenance than usual, and the math of their life. The real math, not the headline math, not the $1,000 a day math, but the what am I actually keeping? What is this actually costing? Where will actually be in 5 years math? Doesn't add up. The future is the load-bearing wall of the architecture of survival. Remove it, and everything collapses. Vea's future has a hair salon. She talks about it the way some people talk about heaven, with a specificity that suggests not just hope, but habitation. She's already living there in some corner of her mind. She can see the chairs and the mirrors and the shelves of product and the LED sign with her name on it, glowing in a strip mall window somewhere in the other Las Vegas, the real Las Vegas, the one where regular people live and work and get their hair done on Saturday mornings. She mentions makeup services, event planning, a bunch of different little side jobs, she says, and her voice lifts when she talks about them. The only time in the entire interview when the practiced flatness gives way to something lighter, something younger, something that sounds, for just a moment, like a 21-year-old who hasn't spent the last year learning that love is transactional and danger is routine and the mask must never, ever come off. She still has her cosmetology license. She mentions it not as a detail, but as an anchor, a point of connection to the person she was before the game, and to the person she intends to become after it. The license is proof that there was a before, and the salon is proof, or at least the promise of proof, that there will be an after. And I want to honor that. I want to say, clearly and without qualification, that the exit is possible. There are women who enter this world and leave it and build exactly what they said they would build. The research shows this. The anecdotal evidence shows this. The salon is not a fantasy by definition. It is a possible future. But I also want to be honest. Because honesty is the only thing I can offer that the game doesn't. According to research compiled by the organization GEMS, Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, one of the most respected organizations working with survivors of commercial sexual exploitation in the United States, approximately 89% of individuals in the sex trade express a desire to exit. The same research indicates that the average number of attempts required to achieve sustained exit is between 3 and 7. 89% want out. The average person tries 3 to 7 times before they make it. The barriers to exit are not primarily motivational. They are structural. A criminal record that appears on every background check and disqualifies the applicant from jobs she's trained for. A resume with a gap that stretches for years and can't be honestly explained. A credit history that, despite the improvement Vea describes, reflects the volatility of the lifestyle rather than the stability that landlords and lenders look for. A body that has been exposed to risk and violence that manifests, eventually, in health costs that the game's tax-free income never accounted for. And then there's the financial cliff. Leaving the game doesn't just mean leaving the income. It means returning to the crossroads. Path A is still there. It still pays $33,000. It's still not enough for a salon, and now it comes with additional obstacles that didn't exist before. The record, the gap, the trauma that hasn't been processed because the game doesn't come with a therapist, the credit score that might be higher than it was, but that carries a history attached to an address and an income source that any decent lender will scrutinize. Leaving the game means going from $1,000 a day, or whatever fraction of 1,000 she actually retains, to $33,000 a year. Overnight, with no transition period, no severance, no unemployment benefits, no safety net of any kind. That financial cliff is not an accident. It's not an unintended consequence of a system that nobody designed. It's the mechanism by which the game retains its players. Because every day that Vea works, the cliff gets steeper. Every day, the gap between what she earns and what the legitimate economy offers grows wider. Every day, the salon gets simultaneously closer, because the credit score is climbing and the experience is accumulating, and further away, because the opportunity cost of leaving gets higher and the psychological habituation gets deeper and the mask gets more permanent. And here is the thing about the salon that I keep circling back to, the thing that I suspect Vea has not yet asked herself. Or, if she has filed away under the same category as the gun and the knife and the forceful men, the category labeled part of the game, not worth thinking about too hard. The man who controls her money is the gatekeeper of the salon. He holds the earnings. He manages the credit. He decides the timeline. If the salon happens, it happens because he facilitates it. If the exit happens, it happens because he permits it. And the question that Vea may not be asking, but that we, as people who have the luxury of distance and the responsibility that comes with it, have an obligation to ask, is this: what incentive does a person who profits from someone's labor have to help that person become independent of them? It's not a trick question. It's an economics question. And the answer is obvious to anyone who has ever studied the incentive structure of any managed economy in history. The manager's interest is in perpetuation, not graduation. You don't build a system to liberate the people who power it. You build it to keep them powering it. And you maintain their compliance not through chains. Chains are crude, visible, prosecutable, but through hope. Hope of a salon. Hope of a car. Hope of a credit score. Hope that this, all of this, the nights and the danger and the men and the money and the mask, is temporary, is building towards something, is a means to an end that will justify the means. The salon may be the most effective retention tool in the entire game. Not the money, not the lifestyle, not the daddy who provides structure and script and the illusion of partnership. The dream. Because as long as the dream exists, the present is survivable. And as long as the present is survivable, the exit stays theoretical. And as long as the exit stays theoretical, the money keeps flowing. Upward, always upward, in the direction it's been flowing since the first night. Vea is 21. She has a license and a dream. And the man who profits from her labor has every incentive to keep the dream alive and the salon forever in the future tense. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the salon opens next year, or the year after, and Vea stands in front of it with scissors in her hand and her name on the sign and the game behind her like a city she drove through once and never went back to. I hope that. And I'm afraid of the numbers. Underscore. I've listened to Vea's words many times now. More times than is probably healthy. And with each listening, I notice something new, not in what she says, but in the architecture of how she says it. She has a verbal pattern that becomes visible only through repetition. When she's asked a question that approaches something real, something underneath the makeup and the confidence and the $1,000 a day arithmetic, she begins her answer with a buffer phrase. I guess you could say. I don't know. Definitely. Which, paradoxically, functions in her speech not as emphasis but as deflection, a word deployed to sound certain while creating space for uncertainty. These are hedge phrases, linguistic cushions. They do the same work in conversation that the tissue does for her makeup. They absorb the small cracks before they become visible. and she uses them in a very specific pattern. When she talks about money, her daily quota, the quality of the income, the comparison to her previous life, she's direct, specific, numeric. 1,000. Tax-free. Pretty good income. No hedging. No cushions. The money is solid ground. She can stand on the money. When she talks about the danger, the weapons, the forceful men, the emotional toll, the hedging appears immediately. I mean, not really, because I know it's just a part of the game. Not everyone's going to want to do what they're signing themselves up for, I guess you could say. I don't take that as too much of a deterrent. Every sentence about danger contains a linguistic shock absorber. Every acknowledgement of risk is immediately neutralized by a normalizing clause. There's a field of study called discourse analysis that examines exactly these patterns. The basic principle is that the structure of speech reveals cognitive processes that the content of speech may conceal. A person who hedges before a statement is often engaged in real-time management of cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when two contradictory beliefs are held simultaneously. Vea believes the game is a good deal. She also knows she's had weapons pointed at her. These two beliefs cannot comfortably coexist. So the hedge phrases function as linguistic anesthesia. They numb the contradiction just enough to make it speakable. Consider this sentence. I mean, not really, because I know it's just a part of the game. 7 elements, each one performing a specific function. I mean, creates distance between the speaker and the upcoming statement. Not really, minimizes the intensity of the experience being described. Because, introduces a rationalization, converting an emotional response into a logical one. I know. Asserts cognitive control, positioning the speaker as someone who understands rather than someone who suffers. It's just, further minimizes. Just is one of the most powerful diminishing words in English. Apart, partitions the experience, containing it within a larger framework so it doesn't contaminate the whole of the game. Normalizes everything by placing it within the metaphor of a game, which by definition is voluntary, rule-governed, and ultimately not real in the way that being alone in a room with a stranger who has a weapon is real. In 11 words, a 21-year-old woman has processed, contained, categorized, minimized, and neutralized the fact that someone held a weapon to her face. She has performed a complete psychological triage on a traumatic experience, in real time, on camera, without breaking the cadence of casual conversation. That's not resilience. That's machinery. That's the output of a system, internal and external, that cannot afford to let the truth arrive in its full weight. And then there's the moment. The only moment in the entire conversation where the machinery falters. It happens quickly. The interviewer asks about the emotional toll of the work. Vea begins to answer. She talks about weirdos. She talks about men who are not always willing, an inversion of language so subtle that it deserves its own paragraph. Because what she actually means is that some men are unwilling to respect boundaries, but she's framed it as the men being not willing rather than herself being violated, which places the discomfort with them rather than with what was done to her. She talks about the forceful or aggressive ones, and then she stops. She asks for the tissue. She says, I got to get a tissue. I'm sorry. And there it is. The crack. Not in the makeup. The makeup holds. It always holds. That's what it's for. The crack is in the voice. In the I'm sorry. In the instinct to apologize for the possibility of being human. In the reflexive, automatic, deeply trained response that says, if you are about to feel something, you must first ask permission, and then you must apologize. And then you must demonstrate that the feeling has been contained and the mask is back in place, and the professional, competent, in-control woman who earns $1,000 a day and considers this a good choice is still here, still functioning, still earning. She isn't crying. Let me be very clear about that. She is not crying. She reaches for the tissue preemptively, prophylactically, the way you might grab an umbrella when you see a cloud. Not because it's raining, but because you cannot afford to get wet. She cannot afford to get wet. Not here. Not on camera. Not in a life that depends on the mask. The mask that says, I'm fine. This is fine. The game is fine. The money is good and the future is bright and the danger is just a part of it, and I decided to try, and I have no regrets, and marriage is just marriage, and I believe in love definitely, and things are not always as they seem. The tissue catches whatever was about to fall. She presses it under each eye. She adjusts her composure. She says, "Thank you," and "Sorry," and she continues. And the moment passes, and the interview goes on, and Vea goes back to being Vea, the composed, confident, articulate 21-year-old who has made a choice and is living it, and will tell you, if you ask, that her biggest regret is not starting sooner. But the tissue knows. The tissue knows what the words won't say, and the face won't show, and the hedge phrases keep at a distance, and the daily 1,000 can't compensate for, and the salon in the future can't erase. The tissue knows that somewhere underneath the architecture of self-protection, the makeup, the language, the normalization, the dream, there is a person who is not okay, who may not be okay for a long time, who has built such an elaborate and functional system for managing her not okayness that she can sit in front of a camera and describe weapons and coercion and the voluntary surrender of all her income to a man she met on social media, and do it with a smile, and do it without crying, and do it with the only visible disturbance being a preemptive reach for a tissue that she doesn't even end up needing. That's not fine. That's a masterpiece of dissociation. And it's heartbreaking not because it fails, it doesn't fail, the mask holds beautifully, but because it succeeds. Underscore. I want to pull back now. Not away from Vea. Never away from Vea, because she is the center of this story and she deserves to remain there, but outward. To the structures that made her story possible. To the forces that built the crossroads she stood at and the path she had to choose between and the game that was waiting at the end of one of them. Because Vea's story is not an anomaly. It's a data point. One data point in a pattern so large, so consistent, so replicated across cities and states and decades that calling it anything other than systemic would be a lie of omission so profound that it would make the rest of this analysis meaningless. Let me assemble the pieces. A young woman grows up in a household with love, but without financial margin. She watches her parents survive, but never thrive, present but not progressing, working but not building, alive but not. In the economic sense that America valorizes above all others, winning. She earns a professional credential. She does everything the system asks of her. She graduates. She trains. She passes the exams. She receives the license. She prepares to enter the workforce as a contributing, tax-paying, rule-following participant in the American economy. And then the system hands her $33,000 and says, "Good luck." She encounters a man who says, "I can do better than that." She takes the offer. She loses things she doesn't know she's losing. She tells a stranger she has no regrets. Now zoom out. Past Vea. Past Las Vegas. Past the specific details and the personal history and the individual psychology. Zoom out to the country. The United States generates, according to the Urban Institute's landmark study of the underground commercial sex economy, billions of dollars annually in sex trade revenue. The exact number is impossible to determine because the economy is, by definition, underground, but estimates consistently place it in the range of tens of billions per year. The Polaris Project, which operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, has documented over 82,000 situations of potential trafficking since the hotline's inception. In 2023 alone, they identified over 16,600 potential cases. The most common type, by a significant margin, was sex trafficking facilitated by an intimate partner or someone posing as one. Not a stranger, not a kidnapper, a boyfriend, a daddy. Someone who scrolled through Instagram and identified a young woman who was already giving something away for free and said, "Let me show you how good the game can be." The most common age of entry into the sex trade, and this number appears consistently across multiple studies from multiple institutions over multiple decades, is between 15 and 19 years old. Vea entered at 20 or 21. She is, by the standards of this particular demographic pattern, a late starter. She says her biggest regret is not starting sooner. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports that 1 in 6 endangered runaways reported to them are likely victims of sex trafficking. Not suspected victims. Not possible victims. Likely victims. 1 in 6. These numbers are not about Vea. Vea is not a runaway. Vea was not trafficked at 15. Vea has a family and a home and a license and a man she describes, in language that leaves no room for doubt, as someone she works with by choice. But the numbers are the water she swims in. They're the river that carved the channel she's traveling through. They're the reason the man on Instagram exists, and the reason his pitch works, and the reason there's a game to show anyone how good it can be. And beneath all the numbers, underneath the trafficking statistics and the revenue estimates and the Polaris data and the career span studies, there is one number that I keep coming back to. One number that sits at the foundation of everything else, like the bedrock beneath a city. The median annual wage for a cosmetologist in the United States. I am not arguing that low wages cause sex trafficking. The causal chain is longer and more complex than that, and reducing it to a single variable would be irresponsible. But I am arguing, and the data supports this with a clarity that should make every policymaker uncomfortable, that the economic conditions of working-class America create what researchers call a vulnerability landscape. A terrain of insufficient wages, insufficient safety nets, insufficient access to mental health care, insufficient pathways to meaningful financial mobility. Within that landscape, recruiters operate with ease. Because they're not selling a product. They're selling a solution. A solution to a problem that the legitimate economy created and refuses to solve. I can show you how good the game can be. That sentence only works because the non-game alternative isn't good enough. If Vea's cosmetology license came with a pathway to $70,000 a year, with benefits, with stability, with the genuine possibility of salon ownership within 5 years rather than 15 or 20, would that sentence have worked? Maybe. Human decision-making is complex, and I won't pretend that economics is the only variable. But the gap would have been smaller, and smaller gaps produce fewer recruits. This is not speculation. This is observable in every country that has implemented meaningful wage floors and social safety nets. The recruitment pipeline doesn't disappear, but it narrows. The vulnerability landscape doesn't vanish, but it contracts. The crossroads still exists, but the paths are less brutally asymmetric. There's a phrase I encountered in my research that I can't stop thinking about. It comes from Dr. Aine Matheson, who works with survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. We keep trying to rescue people from the water without asking who's throwing them in. Vea is in the water. The game is the water. The recruiter is the current. But the river was built by something much larger than any of them. And until we talk about the river, the wages, the gaps, the structural impossibility of building a future on $33,400 a year in a city where the cost of living rises faster than any paycheck can follow, we will keep producing Veas. One after another. Each one with a license and a dream and a man on Instagram who says he can show her how good the game can be. Before I come back to Vea for the last time, I want to ask a question that almost never gets asked in stories like this one. It's not, how do we save women like Vea? It's not, should sex work be legalized? It's not, who's to blame? The question is simpler and, I think, more important. Why does this conversation always center on the woman? Vea was interviewed. Her face was filmed. Her words were recorded. Her story was packaged and distributed. She is the visible subject, the sympathetic subject, the subject we're all here to understand and, depending on our orientation, to pity or admire or judge or worry about. But she is one vertex of a triangle. The other two are the recruiter and the clients. And those two vertices are almost never in the frame. The recruiter, the man who identified a young woman's vulnerability, offered her an opportunity, that funnels the majority of her earnings to him, maintains control through a system of selective generosity, and has every economic incentive to prevent her from ever achieving the independence she says she's working toward, is not here. He's not sitting in a chair answering questions about his choices. He's not being asked to explain his business model or justify his ethics or reconcile the contradiction between taking care of someone and taking all of their money. He's somewhere else, managing his operation, scrolling through Instagram, perhaps looking for the next 20-year-old who's dibbling and dabbling and doesn't know yet that she has market value. The clients, the men who drive to a specific location at a specific hour, who seek a specific service, who hand over money, who receive what they paid for, who drive home to their wives and their families and their untouched reputations, are not here either. They're not sitting in chairs. They're not being asked about their choices, their marriages, their relationship with the word fidelity. They're somewhere else. At home, at work, at their kids' soccer games. Anonymous, unexamined, unchallenged. And Vea, the person who bears the legal risk, the physical danger, the psychological damage, the occupational deformation, the social stigma, and the ever-present possibility of an encounter that ends not with $1,000, but with something that can't be measured in dollars, is the one in the chair. The camera points at her. Always at her. The story is about her. Always about her. The questions are for her. Always for her. I wonder what we'd learn if, just once, the camera turned the other way. If we spent an hour with a man who makes his living by managing 21-year-old women. If we asked him about his childhood, his family, his view of love, his relationship to the word daddy, his plans for the future, his biggest regret. I wonder what we'd learn if we spent an hour with a married man in the dark car. If we asked him about the gap between his vows and his behavior. If we asked him what he thinks about on the drive home. If we asked him about his view of marriage. Whether, after years of driving to women like Vea, he too has concluded that marriage is just marriage. I don't have those interviews. I can't make those interviews happen because the men in question have something Vea doesn't have, the option of invisibility, the luxury of never being seen, the privilege of participating in a system that scrutinizes its most vulnerable members and ignores its most powerful ones. But I can note the absence. I can point to the two empty chairs and say, someone should be sitting there. Someone who isn't Vea. Someone whose choices created the demand that the game exists to supply. Someone whose invisibility is not a natural condition, but a constructed one. Constructed by laws that criminalize the seller and ignore the buyer. By media that interviews the woman and never the man. By a culture that finds it endlessly fascinating to examine the psychology of a 21-year-old sex worker and profoundly uninterested in examining the psychology of the 45-year-old accountant who drives to her after dropping his kids at school. The chairs are empty. That's the point. Near the end of the conversation, the interviewer asks Vea what advice she would give to a young woman considering entering the game. It's the kind of question that often produces rehearsed answers, either enthusiastic endorsement or performative warning, depending on the narrative the speaker is constructing. Vea's answer is neither. It's something more complicated and more revealing than either of those options. She starts with a caveat. If you're already in school and you got a whole life set, then definitely keep on track. She's telling young women with options to use them. She's not evangelizing. She's not recruiting. She's saying, if you have path A and path A is working, stay on path A. Then she adds, I wouldn't say make this lifestyle something that you just want to if you're off to, 'cause it sounds cool and looks cool and the girls are pretty. Like, no, that I wouldn't let that be a reason that you join the game. This is remarkable, because Vea, who has just spent an hour describing the game in terms that are, on balance, positive, who has said her biggest regret is not starting sooner, who has described the money as pretty good and the work as a good choice, is now telling potential entrants that the aesthetic appeal of the game is not a sufficient reason to join it. She's distinguishing between her experience and the image of her experience. She's acknowledging, obliquely, That what the game looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the inside are two different things. And then she says something that's the closest she comes, in the entire conversation, to identifying the core dynamic of her relationship with her recruiter. If you get into the game, definitely get someone that's going to uplift you, build you, elevate, worry about you, elevate you. She searches for the word. She starts with uplift, moves to build, tries elevate, then interrupts herself, worry about you, and then returns to elevate. That interruption, worry about you, dropped into the middle of aspirational, empowerment-adjacent language like a small stone falling into a pond. She's telling young women to find a manager who worries about them, who cares about their well-being, who is, in some sense, a protector. She's describing a father. And I don't mean that reductively or dismissively. I mean it precisely. The thing she's telling young women to look for, someone who uplifts, builds, elevates, and worries, is a description of good parenting. It's a description of what a loving father provides. It's a description of the thing that was disrupted in Vea's life when she was 12 years old, and that she has been, in various forms and through various mechanisms, trying to reconstruct ever since. The man she found, the man on Instagram, the daddy, provides a version of this. A managed version. A version that comes with a price tag and a power dynamic and an economic structure that is not, whatever else it may be, designed for her graduation. But it's a version. And for a 21-year-old who has been standing at a crossroads between $33,000 and how good the game can be, a version may be the best she believes she can get. The interviewer asks, "Do you have any regrets in your life?" And Vea, 21 years old, 1 year and a couple of days into a life that involves weapons-level violence, sexual coercion, the voluntary surrender of all earnings to a man she calls daddy, the systematic erosion of her belief in marriage, and a salon that exists only in the future tense, says, "Not joining the game sooner than I did." She wishes she'd started earlier. She's 21. She acknowledges she couldn't have started much earlier. But still, sooner. The regret isn't that she entered. The regret is that she waited. And I want to sit with that. Because that statement, those 9 words, is the single most important data point in this entire conversation. Not because of what it says about Vea's values or her judgment or her capacity for self-reflection, but because of what it says about the world that produced her. A 21-year-old woman with a professional license and a loving family and no history of addiction or catastrophic abuse sits in a chair and says, on camera, with conviction, that her biggest regret is not entering the sex trade sooner. What kind of world produces that sentence? Not a world where the game is particularly wonderful. Vea's own description makes clear that it involves danger, degradation, economic exploitation, and the progressive numbing of her emotional and relational capacities. But a world where the alternative is sufficiently bleak that the game, with all of its costs, visible and invisible, still looks like the better option. That's not a statement about Vea. That's a statement about the crossroads, about the gap, about the distance between $33,000 and the life she wants to live in the absence of any legitimate bridge across that distance. She's not choosing the game because the game is good. She's choosing the game because Path A is worse. And the fact that Path A is worse, the fact that a licensed professional in the richest country in the history of the world can look at her legitimate career options and conclude that selling access to her body to strangers, managed by a man who takes all the money, in an environment where weapons are just a part of the game, is the preferable path, is an indictment so severe that it should keep policymakers awake at night. It won't, of course, because policymakers don't watch interviews with 21-year-old sex workers in Las Vegas. And because the system that produces the crossroads is the same system that produces their salaries and their pensions and their re-election campaigns. And because the word choice, that reliable, load-bearing, conversation-ending word, is always available to close the file. She chose. She chose. She chose. And the crossroads keeps producing new Veas. And the man on Instagram keeps scrolling. And the married men keep driving in the dark. And the salon keeps living in the future tense. And the tissue keeps catching what the makeup can't hold. And nobody is looking at the river. Underscore 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 underscore. Let me tell you where we are. We've spent a long time with Fea. We've examined her recruitment, her economics, her psychology, her clients, her advice, her regrets. We've zoomed into the texture of individual sentences and zoomed out to the structural conditions of an entire economy. And I would rather leave you with honest uncertainty than with comfortable conclusions that let you close the file and move on to the next story. But I want to return to where we started. Because stories that matter, stories that do what stories are supposed to do, which is to change the way you see the world, even slightly, even temporarily, and where they begin. They return to the image, the detail, the small and almost nothing moment that contains everything. The tissue. She stopped the interview to ask for a tissue. She pressed it under each eye with the precision of a cosmetologist, which she is, still, underneath everything else. Licensed, trained, competent. A person who knows how to care for a face, even when the face is a mask. Even when the mask is the only thing between her and whatever it is she's not ready to feel. She said, "I'm sorry." She apologized for being human. In the middle of a story about weapons and coercion and economic exploitation and the slow, invisible, irreversible erosion of a 21-year-old's capacity to believe in love, she apologized for the possibility that she might show an emotion. That apology is the truest thing she said. And I keep thinking about what happens when the tissue isn't enough. When the makeup can't hold. When the setting spray fails and the foundation cracks and the concealer gives up and the face underneath. The real face. The 21-year-old face. The face that lost a father at 12 and found a game at 20 and hasn't cried on camera and hasn't cried off camera. Probably because the game doesn't have a budget for crying. When that face finally surfaces. What happens then? Who's there? Not the clients. They're anonymous. They're home. They're wearing their rings. Not the recruiter. He's managing. He's scrolling. He's showing someone else how good the game can be. Not the camera. The camera got its interview and moved on to the next story. Who's there? I don't know. And that, I think, is the point. That's the thing that should keep us awake. Not the $1,000 a day or the weapons or the married men or the managed economy. But the question of who is there, who will be there when the mask finally comes off. Because masks have a lifespan. They work until they don't. And when they stop working, when the tissue can't catch it and the hedge phrases can't contain it, and the normalization can't neutralize it, and the dream of the salon can't justify it, the person underneath needs someone. Not someone who wants something from them. Not someone who manages them. Not someone who drives to them in the dark and drives away in the light. Someone. Vea hasn't found that person yet. Or maybe she has, and that person follows her on Instagram and thinks she looks happy. She looks very happy. The makeup is excellent. The mask is professional grade. The smile is convincing. The confidence is real, or real enough, or real in the way that things are real when you've committed to them so completely that the commitment itself becomes indistinguishable from truth. She's 21. She has a license and a dream and a game and a daddy and a daily quota and a belief in love that she says is definite and a belief in marriage that she says is dead and a biggest regret that she says is not starting sooner and a tissue in her hand that she says is for the makeup. And the most important lesson she's learned in her 21 years is, things are definitely not always as they seem to be. She's right, including, maybe especially, about herself. Underscore 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 Vea holds a valid cosmetology license in the state of Nevada. At the time of the interview, she had been in the sex trade for 1 year and a couple of days. She stated that she plans to open a hair salon. We hope she does.